morning. Yesterday, Pablo Masili introduced this topic, so I'm not going to go into detail. He talked about the applications, Android applications, and he also said that we have the possibility of encrypting the offline database. So we're going to go straight into the GAM. There have been a lot of improvements in version 15 up to version 16, and this we already have in version 15. It's the event, so I'm not going to go into much detail. It's the possibility of triggering procedures done with GeneXus or not, based on a GAM event. For example, the insert of a user, the update, the delete of a user in the GAM database can trigger an event programmed by us. In the case in which we insert a user, for example, it can serve to keep in the GAM database and in the database of the application what the user has included. Another event is the update of the user's roles. We have also introduced lately in one of the last upgrades of version 15 the possibility of executing events when we use the Authentication GAM remote that is done both on the side of the client of the provider and the provider of identities. Then the update of the roles, the login and the logout, which are also events that may be interesting if they produce the execution of our events of ours. And when the permissions check fails, it's also interesting to trigger an event of ours to warn that a user does not have the necessary authorization to execute an action. This is another functionality that we already have, and you probably know it already, the fact that we can have dynamic menus, which means that we create the menu and the user, according to its parameters and roles, will have instances for the corresponding menu. You can interrupt me if you want to ask questions, of course. What's interesting is that now we have the possibility authenticating with a new type of authentication. It is called OAuth 2.0. It is generic. As an authentication means varies, especially in Office 365, Mercado Libre, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google, and Facebook, that already had it. That is to say, we already had Google and Facebook as a type of authentication that use OA.0, but now we have added the new ones. These are the ones we have been testing, but they're not the only one. There may be other providers for OA.0 to which we can connect in order to use them as authentication means. It functions like in Google, Facebook, and Twitter. That is to say, you have to create an application on the side of the provider. You are going to receive some credentials, and with those you configure in the GAM that kind of authentication, AO.0, with those creations in order to connect to the provider. And the login is executed in the provider, just like in Facebook. The login is done on the side of the provider, and he is the owner of the user's credentials. Now we have the possibility of having more of one kind of authentication in a repository. In the past, we were unable to define, for example, two types of Facebook authentication or of GAM remote, and now we have lifted that limitation, which means that if you look at the examples of the GAM, the login has changed so that you can authenticate against the same kind of authentication in the same repository. The login Facebook in this manner was done in web applications, and now it's become GAM repository.login, and there you have the user and additional parameters, and there we are going to specify the name of the kind of authentication. The kind of authentication can be repeated. There can be n Facebook in my repository and types of Facebook authentications in my repository. In the additional parameters, I'm going to specify the concrete name of the kind of authentication to which I want to connect. This is just by way of review, because you have probably seen the changes if you have version 15 upgrade 11 or 12, if I'm not mistaken. In smart devices, the external login used to receive as a parameter the type of authentication. Today, it receives something similar as a parameter, the name of the type of authentication plus the type of authentication, in order to allow for the flexibility I was telling you about, which means that in the knowledge base you will have new objects and SDTs that allow us to have as a parameter the name of the authentication. The previous way of execution is still compatible. The previous login is still valid because it has compatibility. You don't need to change the programming of objects. I have a question. Is there a way of passing the repository? Yes, I'm going to tell you about it next. Precisely, we have benefit from the new SDTs as parameters that include these elements for login, so that besides supporting more than the same type of authentication in the repository, you can go to the repository. And this is exactly what answers your question. Login external addition parameters is the one I was telling you about, and it has this. You have here the possibility of going to the repository. Let me explain. In smart devices applications, we always had and still have the possibility of having it enterprises, that is to say, to connect it to more than one repository. For this, we have a file connection.gam with a connection to each one of these repositories that corresponds to each one of the enterprises. What we did in the past in order to support this environment was, before the login, we did a such connection for the repository that was relevant according to the enterprise. This is still valid today, but besides, we are able to establish at the time of doing the login the repository to which we want to connect, which is the repository that corresponds to the enterprise, without going through the procedure that does the set connection. And linked to this, we always also support, and this is new, we support having REST services in a multi-enterprise environment. In the past, we were unable to call REST services in an environment where there was more than one repository. There was no way of calling it. There was no way of doing the post to a REST service so that it would connect to one or other repository. Now, after the changes I told you about, it's possible, because in the call you can include the repository to which it should connect, which corresponds to the enterprise to which we want to connect. This is important because many have asked for it. In applications where we have a single sign-on environment, we have an identity provider and clients. These clients necessarily have to have a GAM, and the identity provider has its own GAM. We were restricted in the past to having each one of the clients connecting to an independent GAM. Now it's possible that all clients use the same GAM, the same database of the GAM. Am I making myself clear? And this precisely because of what I told you previously. As we lifted the limitation of having to have one same kind of authentication, one single type of authentication, for example, a GAM remote by a repository, that limitation forced to have one GAM for each client. Now it's possible to have several types of GAM remote per repository. So we can have the same GAM database for all of our clients in the single sign-on. Well, I think it's not a doubt. I'm happy. This would replace the scenario of single sign-on with remote GAM. It was possible to have a GAM with a unique database, and the clients did not have the GAM authorized for them, and they had a single sign-on. No, it's not like that. The clients have to have a GAM. That's because of how it works. Basically, it works like this. The client, when he logs in, calls the identity provider. The login is done in the identity provider because that's where the users are, etc. But then it comes back to the client, and in the client, the user persists without the login, but the session and the user are inside the client. What I mean is you cannot avoid the GAM on the side of the client. Yeah, but there is a scenario in the wiki which I have implemented where I don't have the integrated security in the client's KB, but I have a remote GAM, and the single sign-on is implemented in that way. The login is done in the remote GAM, then it comes back to the client's application, and something has to be programmed by manually, so that would be replaced by authorizing the GAM in each client, and that would be automatic. Is that your idea? Well, let's see if I understand you. Up to now, it was necessary to do the GAM for each client? No, precisely not. There is a scenario in which you can do a single sign-on with clients that don't use GAM. It can be, for example, for non-GeneXus applications. That's how I have implemented it, and now you could do it in this other way. No, because it's still necessary that the client has a GAM. What we are introducing now is the possibility that all clients use the same GAM. If you had 10 applications in the past, each application had to have its GAM, its database, which was cumbersome because you had to keep 10 GAMs. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I had to implement a remote GAM and program some things manually. Now, if we tell the clients to use the same database of the remote GAM, I could implement it like that. I understand now. Yes, that's the second scenario, is to use only one database. The identity provider uses its GAM, and all clients use the same one that the provider. All clients use the same one as the provider. Yes, that's another possibility. I understood you now. Do you have questions? Any doubts? Here we use necessarily the functionality Impersonate. That's the possibility of having two kinds of authentication, but there's an instance always for one of them. For example, if we want in our company in the intranet to have users authenticated locally, but outside of the company they can authenticate by another means, for example, a web service, well, we want always to have one single user. So if they authenticate by web services, those users impersonate the local user. It ends up being, in every case, a local user. And in this scenario that we were discussing with you, it is necessary to use the impersonator. It is necessary that if we are going to have the database of the GAM with n types of authentication GAM remote, we have to select one type of authentication GAM remote so that all users are impersonated with that kind of authentication. It is really complicated to understand on the fly, but everything is well documented in the wiki. We just want to show this to you so that you see the new things and possibilities we have now. But the details are complicated to explain in depth in a short time. With regard to the anonymous user, well, you know what it is, but I'll repeat it. It is used in smart devices and gives us the possibility of coming in as anonymous, but when it registers, that is when it logs in for the first time, all of the information that was associated to the anonymous user is incorporated to the new user that registers. And now we are not limited as before, because an anonymous user, when he registers through Facebook, Twitter, Google, GAM remote, or AO.0, it's going to work too. That is to say, it's going to incorporate what was in all the information that was in the anonymous user. It's going to be incorporated in this new user. Impersonate too extends to new type of data. Before we could not impersonate with some types of authentication, but now it's possible. Facebook, Google, Twitter, GAM remote, AO.0. And lastly, the Plato GAM. This is another functionality that was requested by you all, the possibility of having environments that are not window. We used to have, for example, one with graphic interface that only worked in Windows, but now we have a GAM deployed tool without interface, which functions in Windows, of course, but also in Unix environments. And this allows us to export data, to import them, to create the connection.gam. And it doesn't allow now the creation of the structures of the tables that would be done through the scripts by the DBA.